I'm Elliot Atkinson. I'm a postdoc over at Northumbria. I'm just going to present some preliminary analysis on our work. It's part of a larger study at the moment, looking at the female sort of veteran brain health. And this is just a preliminary analysis. You want purely look at the neuromuscular component. So a little bit of a brief history, just in terms of women's involvement in the military over the years. So women have been involved pre-World War II, but World War II was kind of the first sort of official mobilization of women at the time. So there was a mass conscription in 1940, but it was a very distinctive role, although some did see sort of more combat-intensive operations at the time. Since then, through the 80s and 90s, women's involvement have become much more closely aligned with men, things like in the Gulf War and in Northern Ireland in particular, until we get to today, as we can see on the far side here, where really women's role is much more homogenized with men. It's particularly with the lifting of combat arms roles to women in 2018. So essentially, there is no distinction between what men and women can do within the British Armed Forces currently. So with that in mind, when looking at female veterans, this is data out to the US, but they found, and one thing to note here is the US have removed restrictions on female involvement in combat operations in 2014, so a few years before us. But they found that on average, a female military veteran who presented with one military-related risk factor, which could either be a traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress disorder, or depression, had a 50 to 80% increased risk for developing dementia. Dementia compared to a female civilian counterpart who hadn't experienced similar sort of trauma. And this is sort of compounded more so when they've had two or more of these risk factors, where there was a further twofold increase on top of that as well for their risk factors for developing dementia. So I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this. As we know, as you go through later life, the risk of dementia increases, and then that sort of results in greater impairment in later life, inability to sort of self-care and things like that. And it's becoming a bigger problem in today's society really as well. So neuromuscular symptoms, which is my background in particular, so neuromuscular symptoms have been seen to precede sort of cognitive dementia or symptoms of cognitive dementia by about sort of 10 or so years. And they've included things like reduced grip strength, bradykinesia or slowing of movements, muscular rigidity as well, and the main one largely is balance and gait impairments as well. So what we've done is this part of the data I'm going to present here, like I said, it's all mostly neuromuscular components, so we're going to see if we see any difference between female civilians and female military veterans. So far we have 8 veteran and civilians matched. Both for roughly age, and also menopausal status. One couldn't be age matched due to their status being a result of a surgical intervention. So there's one offset there. What we use to investigate this. So we use the recordings within the participant's first non-dominant first dorsal interosseous, so the muscle here. We looked at the maximal compounds and maximal electroactivity you can get out of the muscle using mmax. Their motor evoked potential, which looks at the excitability or the connection function of the corticospinal tract from brain to muscle. We looked at short interval cortical inhibition. This was a measure of sort of the inhibitory networks within the cortical area. And similarly, we looked at facilitation of the same area using intracortical facilitation. So what have we seen? Not a lot at this point in terms of the mean scores. So looking at maximal electrical activity out of the muscle, very similar between the groups. Same thing also there with motor evoked potential. The excitability of the corticospinal tract here is on average very similar. Here looking at SICI or the inhibition circuits, again very similar in terms of averages, and same thing again with facilitation of the facilitatory cortical circuitry, again, very similar between the groups. However, what you might have noticed is that in these groups, the veterans themselves are far more spread in their data compared to their civilian counterparts. So looking at the coefficient of variation, so there's no variation, change difference in variation between in terms of the electrical activity, which is understandable. However, when we look at the motor evoked potentials for cortical spinal tract excitability, we see a near doubling in the variation between participants here. Similarly, to varying strengths, so difference, but not quite as more variable here in inhibition, but not quite as bad. But ICF is very similar to motor evoked potentials. And I don't have it here, but I've also looked at intra-participant variability, and they're pretty small. So they are consistently, each individual is consistently variable in their response, if that makes sense. So, sort of, what does this mean then? At the moment, not a lot by itself, not a lot. There's no statistical differences in their motor evoked potentials, their sticky, their ICF. However, the variation analysis might point to the fact might be a window into looking into this more. So we are also collecting. I think it's on the next slide here. Yeah. So moving forward, we are also collecting neuropsychological data. As you can see here, looking at the lifetime stress. A whole batch of neuropsychological testing there. Alongside that, we're also taking a lot of biomarkers, which are currently sitting in freezers. So once all these measures have been processed, we're hoping to pair these together. So those individuals who are more variable and so further away from the mean of those responses potentially might express impairment in these factors here, which we could then potentially lead on. But again, that's a lot of ifs and maybes, and have to see down the line, but yes. But yeah, thanks to the team, and thank you very much. Any questions?
You mentioned about how the risk is higher for people, the veterans with PTSD, and
yes.
Do you know if one of those contributed more heavily than another? Do you know what it was split as? Or?
No, I can't say for certain. I mean, sort of hopefully when we start picking apart the neuropsychological data, which is where we take those, we bring those things down so we can see whether or not they've had a TBI, if they've been diagnosed with post-traumatic. That's something we can answer down the line potentially, but not currently, no.
Hi, Elliot. Just so you mentioned the importance of military-related events.
Sure. Yes.
I guess within that spectrum, there's some people might have been exposed to more, some to fewer, some might have a more severe or a less severe. And I guess one important factor to my mind that might influence that is what someone's role within the armed services was.
Yeah.
Whether they were, say, an officer versus
so
frontline,
yeah.
whether they were in a different branch. Do you have any information on who your veterans
are? Not with this data set here, but we are collecting across the spectrum. We are noting them down, and we are going into specifics in terms of what was the event, what did you see, etc., and things like that. And we've also expanded out our classification of kind of combat stress, so to speak. So we're even incorporating individuals who may not necessarily been deployed outside of the country, but they may be at the receiving end of a medical returning sort of soldier who had just recently been injured and returning, and they've had to deal with sort of that aspect, but UK side. But yes, but it's something we will split down later on down the line. We have more time to go through the data a bit more, with a bit more fine-tooth comb.
Thank you. I think we'll move on there. So that's great. Thank you, Elliot.
Cheers, thank you.